What was the significance of the Prophet ﷺ not allowing the writing down of hadith in the early days of his prophethood? I'm going to go to my slide. Priority, Quran. What was the priority at that time? The main priority was to write down the Quran in the early years of the Prophet. Clear? So what the priority was given to? The Quran, and that should always be your utmost priority. First you study the Quran, then you study the hadith, and then you study any other school of thought or any other, spiritualism. Remember, what happens is when we start studying, we go the opposite direction, the wrong way round, starts studying school of thoughts or starts studying spirituality, different spiritual school of thoughts. What happens is, because we are not sure in our beliefs or we don't have a proper belief, we get mixed up, right? So the priority even today should always be to start from the Quran, then the hadith, and then to any other resource, basically. Somebody had to come in. Somebody wanted to come in. No. Why did I hear that? Okay. Then limited resources. Why do you think I have limited resources here? I have limited resources written.
And because at that time these were a limited resource.
No, not well. You've tried to give a good answer, but limited resource. What do I mean by limited resource? Remember, what were they writing on? Bones, leather pieces, bark of a tree. That was also limited in resource. And then the people to write down the Quran, early Muslims were limited in number, because remember, your resource is so much. It's the page of paper you use, the pen you use, the ink you use, the people you use. They're all a part of your resource when it comes to education, basically. So at that time, even they had limited resources. That's why the priority was given to the Quran. When you have limited resource, then what would you do? You would prioritize the Quran only, because remember, early converts were few in number. And then remember, the early converts, they had to migrate to Abyssinia, so the number that was there, they were also reduced. So limited resource. And then you can see I have the slide recognition. Recognition. Why do you think I have recognition there?
To identify the difference between ahadith and the verses of and the words of Allah.
Yes, that's very important. In the beginning, they had to recognize the style and the eloquence of the Quran, basically. The Arabic of the Quran, when you do study hadith, you will realize that the Arabic of the Quran and the Arabic of hadith that are narrated is very different. If they would have started writing it at that time, the hadith is down, they would have got it muddled up and mixed up. They wouldn't be able to recognize it. But once they recognized the style of the Quran, it was easy for them to differentiate the style of the hadith, because hadith is like a regular composed person speaking. Whereas when it's the Quranic style is, rhythmic and melodious. It's different. It's poetic. So it gave them time to recognize the style of the Quran different from the style of the hadith. And then you can see I have difference. Based on this recognition, what would they do? They managed to differentiate between the style of the Quran and then again the style of the hadith. So I have the word confusion there. Why do you think I have the word confusion?
To eliminate the confusion of the people in the difference between ahadith.
Yes, so that
the
they don't get confused between, because your audience, remember, okay, the companions could be intellectual enough to understand the difference and could recognize. But remember, the audience that you are narrating the Quran to or the hadith to, they could be confused. They could take, the hadith as words as the Quran, or they could take the words of the Quran as words of the hadith. To save the community from confusion, also, it was very necessary. Clear? Because remember, not everybody knew how to read and write, so they had to be clear in their, limitations of what they're supposed to write down and what they're not supposed to write down. Then, in Medina, it was allowed. So how many years after was the Makki life? 13 years was the Makki life, and then they shifted to Medina. Do you think 13 years is enough to understand the style of the Quran, and to understand the style of the Quran and how it's supposed to be written, and the Arabic, the dialect that is used? Do you think 13 years is enough?
No, ma'am.
No? Why not?
Because, ma'am, for some people it takes a lot longer to understand things, and especially the Quran.
Okay, a language. Suppose you enter into school in grade 1, right? And you're learning English for the first time. By grade 13, have you learnt English or not?
We have.
We have. So do you think now, I'm going to ask you the question again, to understand the language of the Quran, do you think 13 years was enough?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Okay, so in Medina now it's clear and distinct. They're familiar with the style of the Quran. They won't mix it up. Now in the time of Medina, when there was a massive, they had loads of students now, loads of preachers. This, the Muslim community was huge. And they had people, educated people coming in from Faris, Persia, coming in from the Byzantine, people converting and coming in who were bringing their languages as well. That was the time when in Medina, finally, the Prophet allowed that you can write down the hadith. Clear? Now, proof that, because, when we claim that the Prophet allowed the companions to write down the hadith in Medina, then we need proof and logic to prove our answer. So where are we going to get that logic from? The Prophet ﷺ made dua for Abu Huraira. When Abu Huraira came to the Prophet and said, I memorize so many hadiths, but I want to memorize more. So the Prophet ﷺ, for one thing, he did dua for him for his memorization, and along with that dua, he said that use your right hand. Using your right hand, what? Was he supposed to eat food with it to remember hadith? No. What was he supposed to do?
You're supposed to write with his right hand.
Write with your right hand. And then we have a hadith in which Abdullah bin Amr also narrates the fact that I had written down so many hadiths in my time, and I mentioned it to the Prophet that I write down the hadiths in order to memorize them properly. And then the Prophet answered him that go ahead, write it down, because I speak nothing but the truth. So we have two clear hadiths in which, let me let somebody in. I think somebody's there to be let in. No, there is, yes. Okay. Clear, does that make sense? Then Ali bin Abu Talib. Why do you think I've got his name there?
And because he was the city of knowledge and Muhammad was the gate.
Yeah, that could be one reason. Plus, remember, Ali bin Abu Talib had written down documents about zakat and inheritance. During the life of the Prophet made him write down the laws of inheritance and different rules of zakat. Clear? Plus, all the letters that were ever sent to different kings of the time or different leaders, they were all written down. Hadith proof, that is proof that the Prophet allowed the writing down of hadith during Medina. And then in Medina, everything, the hadith, the wording of hadith, and the circles in which they used to study the hadith, it was clear and distinct. Clear? In other words, the hadith language was totally clear. It was normal Arabic, but there was no slang in the Arabic language. Because like when we are speaking, suppose I'm speaking Urdu, I will enter in many slang words. If I'm speaking English, I'm going to enter into many slang words, enter many slang words into my conversation. But if you come across, somebody belonging to the royal family or something like that, how would they speak? They would speak in this posh tone and keeping all of their words perfect. So the difference, there was a clear and distinct difference in the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It was clear, classical Arabic language, very distinct from regular people talking. Clear?
Yes, ma'am.
So do you think that's enough material for us to discuss about the Prophet? What was our question? If I go back to the question, what was the significance of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam not allowing the writing down of hadith in the early days of his prophethood? We have the answers here, and then we have the answers here. Do you think it would be enough material to cover?
Yes, ma'am.
Ma'am.
Would you manage to write me an answer?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, shall we go to the next slide?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.